So let's move on to the electrical certificate. We're going to look at a sale agreement. Again, this is not for one specific company. There's a bit of a mix and match in here just to highlight some interesting points. But it says here, the seller undertakes to furnish the purchaser prior to date of occupation by the purchaser or date of transfer, whichever is earlier, a valid certificate of compliance and, if applicable, a test report in respect of the property. Now, back in the day, your test report and your certificate were all in one document. That's not the case anymore. The certificate is a Department of Labor document that you can just download and fill in. And the test report is referring to all the readings, the number of points in the property. You cannot have a certificate without a test report, so you don't need to mention test report. It's unnecessary. And it mentions the electrical installation regulations and machinery regulations. Now, machinery is a separate set of rules for fixed appliances. It's got nothing to do with a compliance certificate for the sale of a property. The seller warrants that as at date of occupation of transfer, whichever is earlier, there will have been no additional alteration. Very important. Even if that's not stated, it's still implied. I mean, you can't go and change something after a certificate's issued and expect the certificate to still be valid. So no change or alteration on the property subsequent to the issue of that certificate. And then all costs incurred in obtaining the certificate and test report, including cost of repairs, are for the seller. And here's an important point. Upon the seller furnishing the purchaser with such a certificate, this purchaser shall have no claim whatsoever against the seller. So if the seller uses a fly-by-night, the purchase is done. If there's problems afterwards, there's no way to go back to them. Now, the electrical, in my mind, is probably the most important of all the certificates. Why? Well, if we think of the cost of average quotes that go out, take a biggish house, what's normally the highest quote? Electrical, water, beetle, gas. And unless there's beetle with a big fumigation, or 2 or 3 geysers that are burst on the same property, which is unusual, electrical's always the most. Are electricians charging higher fees? Our labor rate's the same, gas, electrical, water, same for everything. So why is it more expensive?
Liability?
No. Our markup for material is the same, our labor rate's the same. Why is it more expensive? Look at this room. How many water points do you see? How many gas points? How many, no electric fence, but how many light points are there? How many plug points? So if these lights are installed incorrectly, and we don't know if they are, but if they were, you could have, 25 faults right here. Okay, so the electrical has the most potential to be a big quote if it hasn't been done right. Okay, so for that reason, we need to make extra sure that the electrician issuing the certificate is properly registered, because he makes a declaration. Now, if you have a false declaration, it's fraud. And look what he's saying here. And this is on every certificate. It's not our wording. It says, ID number, a name and ID number, a registered person declare that I have personally carried out the inspection and testing of this property and deem it to be reasonably safe, basically. So that means the person signing the certificate has to be on site. Okay? We have got 50, 60 certificates on file at the office where the electrician that signed it has never been to site. Not our certificates, other people's certificates. There was a stage where one quite prominent company, the owner of the business was signing everything, every single certificate they issued, never going to site. There was another one, also quite a well-known compliance company, where the person signing the certificate was 85 years old. Okay, so he was just sitting at home signing. And they had a fairly decent electrician doing the inspection, but he was a single-phase tester, and some of these certificates require 3-phase electricians to sign off. So if anything went wrong, even if he did a perfect inspection and something went wrong, and it was found that he wasn't there, it's fraud. Okay, so how can you prevent that from happening? Just ask the electrician's name and the plumber's name if you're on site when they do the inspection, and just compare it to the certificate afterwards. If it's not the same, then you say, I want this person here, he must come check himself. We've had a few situations, I'm jumping to solar now, that happened on the solar side, where there was big problems on a solar installation. Then the electrician that signed off came in, and he didn't know where the DB was. And he was only there like 3 days ago, according to the certificate. Okay, so you can see what happens if things are not done correctly. So let's ask a question for the audience. How long is the electrical certificate valid for?
2 years.
2 years, okay. Where did the 2 years come from? So back in 2000, up till 2009, the regulation said the electrical certificate is freely transferable, which means you could buy a house and you could give that certificate to the buyer, and then he could give that certificate to the next buyer and the next one, and there was no time limit. Obviously, that's problematic. So they brought it down to 2 years to make it more reasonable. But does that mean that 2 years is a reasonable time for you to reuse a certificate? It is legal if the seller insists, but is it a good idea? And we're going to look at the reasons for that now. Okay. So the first thing we have here, subject to the provision of section 10.4 of the Act, that's the OSH Act, which we'll get to now, the user or lessor may not allow a change of ownership if the certificate is older than 2 years. So that's where it comes from. And then the question is, should you let a seller use a certificate that's nearly 2 years old? Just let's go back to that, a portion of that sale agreement, the electrical clause, and it says the seller warrants that as at date of occupation or transfer, whichever is earlier, there will have been no addition or alteration to the electrical installation. Now, guys selling a house, 2 years later, do you really think there's been no changes? Have they not taken down light fittings, put new lights up, replaced a plug or two, added something, done what they need to do to live there? But here's another point. So the seller sells, but he's still in the house for 3 months after the certificate's issued, and then the buyer moves in, and that buyer wants to reuse the certificate, and he's prepared to sign. He's made no changes. Can he sign that for the seller of the previous transaction? He can't. Now, what would happen if you purchased the property, or a buyer purchased the property, and there were 2 faulty plugs and the earth leakage is not working? And they call the electrician back, and he actually did it for the previous transfer, and it's 18 months later, or even the same. Yeah, it's 18 months ago from the previous time it was issued. Maintenance is not covered by the certificate. So that electrician is going to say, look, this is valid now. I mean, if we did an inspection now, we're going to fail it. But you can't come back to me after 18 months for a faulty plug. Okay, so let's look at why it's not a good idea. Should you let a seller use a certificate that's nearly 2 years old? Well, maintenance-related issues are not covered. So any plug or light points that no longer work, earth leakage switch is not tripping like it should, earthing problems which are caused by corrosion have developed. And I just want to mention something about earthing problems quickly. We've seen this more and more recently. It's something that's been happening for 10, 15 years, but it's growing. I think electricians that were in one company have moved to another and moved to another, so they've spread this idea that if you've got an old property, so there's 2 types of earthing systems. In a new house, you've got that white wire, twin and earth, or Surfex, it's got an earth wire in it. Or you've got a fairly new house, Parklands area, you've got plastic conduit, it's got live neutral earth in it. But on an old house, Claremont is a very good example, you've got metal pipes with just live and neutral, and the metal pipe was your earth to that point. Everything's bolted together, block nuts, everything's bolted fuss, and that is your earth. They are saying that you can no longer use metal conduit for earthing, and they are correct in a new installation. You can't go and install metal conduit as an earth now. But if the house is 60 years old, and that's the earthing system, you can still pass it. So we've seen quotes, little house out in North Pine, 26,000 Rand to rewire all the lights and plugs because there's no earth wire. They didn't say, and we went to go check it, everything was earthed properly. There just wasn't an earth wire, and so they're quoting for it. This has happened in Harfield Village, it's happened in Claremont, it's happened in Gardens, we've seen it in North Pine. You won't find it in a newer area because they don't have metal conduit, they're newer, they use plastic. So if you see someone calling to rewire for earthing, like a whole lot of points, the whole installation, stop right there, it's not necessary. Then go to a more experienced company to get that checked. Then let's look at equipment that's not covered by a certificate. Any ideas what equipment in a property wouldn't be covered? Yes. Yes, correct. Anything else? Air conditioner, pool pump, and what do we call all of fans? There was a clue there. What do we call these things? Fixed appliances. Now, we've seen sale agreements where it says all fixed appliances must be in good working order. Big problem. Then your fan's going good, and now it's a problem that's got to be fixed. So just be careful of phrases like that. You don't see it often, but be careful what you promise a purchaser, because the electrical certificate is not going to look at whether the stove plate trips or not. If the supply to the stove is faulty, that is a problem for the compliance certificate. But if the stove plate trips, or the air conditioner doesn't come on, or there's an extractor fan in a bathroom not working, we can issue a certificate without replacing that. If it's a bathroom that's got no other ventilation, we'll fail it, because that's a building requirement that a bathroom must have ventilation. So even if it's mechanical, we would fail it then only. But it also depends on the situation in a property. Let's take light fittings. Light fittings are a fixed appliance. Okay? Strictly speaking, they do not have to be working for a certificate to be issued. Can you imagine the number of callbacks we would have if 15 lights in a house are not working? We'd be going back, client's going to contact you, then they're going to contact us. Everyone's upset with each other because, come on, the light should work. And so we do include light fittings because it causes too many questions and too much running up and down. And it's expected, I think, that lights will come on. Now, we're not concerned if there's a chandelier with 25 bulbs and only 2 are working. That light is operational. We don't care about the 23 other bulbs. We just want to see it come on. So 1 bulb at least in the fitting should work. And we do want our clients, and even for you guys, to request that your seller, if possible, before we do the inspection, just make sure there's 1 bulb working in every fitting. And that way, we come in, it makes the inspection easy. We don't have to quote now go and check every single fitting that it is operational, because we are going to call for that. Even though, strictly speaking, we could get away with it. But I think generally in our industry, everybody is calling for that. Let's think of a way maybe where we can, yes?
Sorry, I must just say, from a conveyancing perspective, we get that a lot, or I get that a lot as well, when it's just bulbs after the fact. So after transfer, now there's 1 or 2 light bulbs that the bulb doesn't work. And then they do come back to us, and we do have to, as a matter of professionalism, speak to the, can't say, no, we're not going to bother speaking to anybody. I'll say, sure thing, we'll speak to the people on the compliance side, but please note it's not part of the actual compliance. So it does become a bit of an issue, like the bulb issue. It's a tiny thing, but it's an issue.
And we don't want to operate our business where we fob clients off. And we do like to go have a look if there's a complaint. So, I mean, if someone starts talking about bulbs, now really you feel like you want to send someone there, so you show face at least. It's a cost all the time. I mean, our running costs are higher than a lot of our competitors. He's normally with us, Nick. He normally does the training with us. I didn't want distractions today, so I said nobody else from the company must come. But he's on the road every day. If a client phones us with a problem, usually on the same day, sometimes within half an hour, he's on site. Get there, sort it out. If there's anything wrong, we fix it and we move on. We try not to leave clients in a position where they're feeling dissatisfied. Unfortunately, it's unavoidable sometimes. The expectation of a client could be higher than what the requirement is, especially with a water certificate, which we'll get to just now. But we do try to solve those kind of issues straight away. Let's say you have a house that you know is going to have major renovations, either derelict home or a property where the buyer's going to gut the place. Can an electrical certificate be waived to save the seller money?
Yeah. Don't they have to then make a promise to submit a valid electrical certificate?
Well done. It's not really a promise to anybody, but it is a requirement by law. So we're going to look at, let me just get here quickly. We're going to look at that clause from the OSH Act that told us the certificate has to be less than 2 years old. Okay? Subject to the provisions of 10.4, the certificate must not be older than 2 years, right? So, what does 10.4 say? Because that's why we're doing the certificate, because of section 10.4 of the OSH Act. Now, this is not in the electrical regulations. This is a general clause in the OSH Act. If anything gets sold that needs a safety certificate, this clause kicks in. Doesn't matter if it's a car. You think about, you go take your car for roadworthy before you sell it, you're getting a safety certificate. A toaster's got a safety certificate. Medication often has safety certificates, okay? But what this clause is basically saying is that if the purchaser of that item undertakes in writing to ensure the safety of that item, then the seller is relieved of their duty to do it. So based on this clause, you can get away with not doing an electrical certificate on the property. You might have a problem with a bond attorney sometimes, trying to get this past them. But if the renovation's taking place straight away, If the buyer is planning on having a tenant in the house for 6 months before they renovate, I would be very concerned, because then you're risking someone's life. But if the renovations are going to happen straight away, don't waste the money. We, years ago, at a property in Constantia, it was over 70,000 rands worth of work, big old house, lots of work. Buyer insisted on a compliance certificate just because there was problems between seller and buyer. And on the last day when we were packing up, after doing all that work, they started bashing walls down and just trashing the place. I mean, what a waste of money. We loved the job, but it wasn't the right thing to do for the seller. So yes, certificates can be waived. Yes.
Sorry, I must interject there. I know some of you might already know if I've done it for you before, but exception to the rule, obviously, if there's something like this happening, like a demolition or a huge renovation, either on or just after transfer, that's fine. But see if you can speak to the conveyancers dealing with the transfer. What I do, or we do, is I'll draft a little waiver for the clients to sign. I have both seller and buyer sign it. It's a waiver that basically says the parties agree that they know what the law says and they know what the legal requirements are. However, by agreement, firstly, they're saying that the property will be either extensively renovated or demolished. And by agreement, they are saying that the seller won't be getting any of the compliance certificates, or whichever one the seller won't be getting, because of the renovation or the demolition. It continues then on to saying the responsibility is now placed on the buyer to do so, whether it is before or after transfer at any point in time. So it puts the ball in the buyer's court. And then most importantly, it includes an indemnity in favour of ourselves, and I put an indemnity in there for you guys. So it says the transfer attorneys as well as state agent is indemnified from any damages due to this. Because you guys may or may not have spoken to these people about it, may or may not have given advice, may or may not have said this is how it's going to work, etc., etc. So despite anything having been discussed or advice having been given by attorney or estate agent, we are both indemnified. You guys have agreed to this, you're signing, you can carry on.
Perfect. No. One thing we don't like to do is issue a partial certificate. Okay, so let's say they're renovating the kitchen and part of the house. That gets complicated now, because you don't know if some of that wiring is feeding other sections of the house. Now you've got an earthing problem here. Now we're going to exclude this, but now to solve that earthing problem, you've actually got to work here. So we don't like partial waivers. We prefer all or nothing approach. Then the lines of responsibility are very clear. And we're going to talk a little bit about this when it comes to, in fact, I'll actually just mention it now. What happens when two contractors need to issue a certificate on the same property? This happens with solar a lot. Okay, we're going to get into the solar side now. Now, there are some companies that rent out solar systems. I'm not going to mention names because of the camera, but it's becoming such a headache because they are doing that installation at rock bottom price. And so they take shortcuts and they squeeze everything into the main distribution board. We find single-phase houses with three-phase main switches because there's no space to put two separate main switches in. So they use a three-phase main switch. Two of the poles are for the, one pole is for the main house, the main supply, one pole is for the solar, and then the neutrals just run together through the neutral. So they're trying to save space. It's illegal. Now, who signs that off? They've put everything in one board. If we're signing off the main house and someone else is signing off the solar, we want separate DBs. A separate DB for essential circuits, separate DB for us. We can't take responsibility for the same thing. In some of these situations, it was they didn't want to go through that cost, the solar rental company. So in some of the cases, they actually signed off the whole main board. We did the rest of the property. We've got to be very careful that we don't take the fall for bad work done by somebody else. Solar is a big problem, and we're going to get to that right now. Now, before I even start this, I've got to have a bit of a disclaimer. Much of this information is what we've gathered ourselves. The written rules are not so clear yet. So I'm speaking from experience, what we've had to deal with. I'm not saying everything here is factually correct or will be correct in a year's time. This is in a state of flux. So let's just talk about solar supplies and backup systems. Now, I hope I'm connected to the Wi-Fi. We want to have a look at why solar is dangerous. So let's see if this thing starts automatically. Okay.
This is a brief demonstration showing the intensity of arc.
I'm switching the sound off. I'll just explain it. Just 4 panels. Now, solar systems on roofs have much more. Okay, so whatever you see here is magnified by the number of panels that you get. So they're just taking the two cables, positive and negative. They're supposed to be red and black. And that's what happens when you bring them in contact. It's a welding machine. It's like, have you ever put terminals across a car battery? It will weld them together, okay? So that's what happens, and that's why it's so dangerous. That doesn't trip a circuit breaker. Like if you had a fault on the normal AC or alternate current side of your property after your distribution board, you touch live and neutral, boom, circuit breaker comes down. Even on the old fuse boards, the fuse will blow. There's nothing to blow that. Okay. So then with that in mind, this is a photograph from a property in Hout Bay where a proper solar company did this installation. What?
Sorry, it's my photo.
It's coming.
Sorry.
It's live, it's live. This is just proving that it's live. So this picture's the wrong way around. I couldn't fit it in properly the other way. Those are the roof tiles, and those are the cables coming from the panels through the roof tiles. Can you imagine those tiles cutting into the cables? Earth wires there. But what do you notice about them? They're all black. How do you know which one is positive and which one is negative? Okay. Then we follow that cable. It then goes into a conduit very nicely. It should have been in a conduit as it came through there. And we lift up some of the insulation because they've got green insulation in the roof. And that's what you find. Now imagine a plumber walking over those cables, creating the tiniest little nick in the cable, and now you've got arcing happening up against your beams in the roof. It's a fire hazard. Okay. And then we get some guys that like to do their own solar systems. And then you see this kind of stuff on the roof. The panels are just glued down with silicone or Segamestic. These connector blocks are not rated for this purpose. They're just lying straight on the roof. Now, I've seen this in Simonstown and False Bay. I don't know who's doing them. Panels directly on roof, not allowed. You've got to have ventilation. Some of these panels, you can actually see, if you look carefully, they've collapsed. You can see, it's a bit hard to tell on the picture, but the panels have half melted from the heat of the actual roof sheets underneath. Then the cables all just go over the edge. At least they're red and black. But look at this ingenuity here. Plumbing pipes for busbar. Okay. And then that goes down now to the inverter. So funny enough, we did an inspection on this house. Very difficult cellar. Fortunately, the attorney was fantastic. Very difficult cellar. They kicked us off site because the quote was over 30K to solve just the solar side of it. You can see why. Got another company in. Company came and did the inspection, well-known company. Did the inspection, and then when they started working, the client said, are you going to fix the solar as well? And they were like, we didn't notice any solar. Okay. So then they got kicked off site and we got the whole job at the end. Okay. But how do you not see that? Like when you're doing an inspection. And the inverter's next to the DB. I mean, so, okay. Dangerous setup. That's the point of these pictures, okay? And so many little solar companies popped up when all the load shedding happened. So Nick, who's normally with me, there's a tow truck driver whose kid is at the school with him. He started his own little solar company. Just YouTube, learned how to do it, and now he's putting in solar systems. Some electrician is just signing it off. Probably that same guy didn't know where the distribution board was that we came across. And we actually came across 3 houses in Claremont and Harfield Village, all signed off by the same electrician. So obviously, and he never goes to any of the sites. And that is why when we see that there's solar, before we even go there, we're already dreading it, because someone's got to take responsibility. We no longer inspect solar systems properly. Okay? If the client wants us to issue a certificate on a solar system, we refer another company, very, very good company, specialist in solar and lots of other things, and they go and do the solar side of the inspection. We know where we draw the line of responsibility. Yes?
Is it the same certificate that's used? So
We're going to get there. It's a good question, Stephen. Yeah.
Are you both going to issue the same certificate, but theirs only has the solar?
So the one describes the installation from the main distribution board onward, and theirs describes the installation from the solar panels.
But it is the same certificate.
It looks the same. There's no separate kind of certificate. You'll get 2 documents.
That's my question. So
Yeah.
if you were capable of doing it, would you have inverter, battery backup, solar? all
One
in
COC. But now you're going to get 2. Ours will be the initial certificate because we're doing the whole property. Theirs will be a supplementary certificate, and they will quote our initial certificate number So the two together cover the whole
Okay,
installation.
You've just done one for me in Sunningdale where your guys took a photo of the garage and they said ours ends here,
Yeah,
and then inverter, battery, solar.
ends there. So we have got to draw the line. We do have, I mean, our guys know how to work with solar. The simple installation, sometimes we'll still take it on, especially if it hasn't been done badly. Then there's just one or two little things to fix. Some of these are done so badly, we cannot. We had one now. Solar panels, very badly done. They're not mounted properly on the roof. It's an asbestos roof.
What is checked?
What is checked on the solar side?
Yeah, I mean, is, like,
Well, we're not really worried about this.
integrity, the weight that it can
Yeah,
carry?
we're not going to look at that. We issued in electrical compliance and safety on the electrical side. But yes, all of that stuff has to be considered when the installation is being done. But if you're putting 8 panels on a tiled roof, you don't really have to worry about the structure. But if you've on a flat roof and now you've got to put lintels on the flat roof to weigh down the panels because you don't want to drill into the flat roof, now you've got to consider the weight and the structure. Okay, can it handle that amount of weight? But panels, the right thing to look is there a 10 centimeter gap between the roof and the panels? Ventilation, how the cables come down, how they enter through the tiles. Do you have more than, each set of panels is called a string. The cables that come down is called a string. You don't want 2 strings in the same conduit, okay, because of this arcing problem. The right way to do it, and I'll get to that in a minute, is metal conduit. But lots of people are using plastic, and it is allowed still. Those laws are still going to change a little bit. And there's been a lot of, even from the authorities, you ask them today, can you use plastic conduit for positive and negative together? They say no. 6 months later, they've changed their mind, but they don't come back and tell you that they've changed their mind. Okay, they've now agreed it's fine, but we don't get the information. So we're still calling for it, and then we realize, but they've changed their mind. We even went to training on it when they said, absolutely, you cannot put it in the same conduit. And now they've all changed their mind. So difficult to keep up to date, yeah.
Sorry, I'm hopping on about it. I'm going back to your certificate. You
Yeah.
outsourcing it. Do you just add it to your invoice?
No, they invoice separately. So we actually treat it, we don't want any crossover of responsibility, any invoicing problems.
Okay.
We're treating it separately, yeah.
Okay, but it's something that you would facilitate and arrange.
We would facilitate and arrange, and they will send the account. They're also prepared to wait for payment on registration. Everything's the same, just separate. We separate it.
Sorry, Taran, you said the inverter, the solar certificate needs to refer to the initial certificate, which is the main one for the main house,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
In other words, it's necessarily so that the main one needs to be done first?
Yes.
Or can it,
Well, you can do them simultaneously, but before you produce the document, you need a main certificate number. And we're going to get a little bit into how this is supposed to happen when an installation is going in, a solar installation, which we can talk about now. But yeah, there is problems when we come across a property that's got solar, especially when it's not done well. Then it becomes common. Then the solar people don't want to come back, or they don't even exist anymore. So many solar companies have closed down because this boom of needing to have solar has diminished. Load shedding's almost gone now. People that had money to spend on solar have already done it. And so there's much less. Some companies were booked up 3 months in advance on solar installations. They're sitting on like 2 days now.
that's the only reason I asked you, Taran, sorry, because I had an instance where it just cost us some time, which the parties may or may not be able to afford, is the time. Because in my instance, they needed to wait for the availability for the solar guy, and the solar guy needed to do his part first before,
Yeah.
inspector, whoever comes in to do the main.
We're going to look at now what the right procedure is and what you guys can do when you first get the mandate to try and get things moving before you wait even for the inspections to be done. You see, the inspections are normally done closer to transfer once all suspensive conditions have been met. But if there's solar, you want to start focusing on that quick because it takes time. And we'll get into all of that in a minute. But let's just look at why solar was a problem historically. When we did this course, the people giving the course on solar, very experienced people, came down from Johannesburg, gave the course. They quoted this regulation about an electrical installation. And I raised the question, and they were all like, oh, this is a big problem. So this basically tells you that the electrical installation is any machinery on a premises that's moving electricity from one point to another. But look at point A at the bottom. It excludes any machinery of the supplier that is related to the supply of electricity to the premises. What is solar? It's electrical supply. So technically, this excludes solar. Okay, so it's already a problem. Then when we do a certificate for solar, at the moment there is no separate test report for solar. This is the only question on the certificate. Is alternate power installed? It's hopelessly inadequate. Okay? So there is a test report. In 2021, there was a new standard that was brought out. It is adopted from the French standard. So they brought the French standard into South Africa, very, very good standard, and then they translated it in Pretoria into English. Afrikaans people, I think, did the translation. So it was an absolute mess. So many grammatical errors, but the information is right. The information is right. So we focus on what the information is and not on, but it was withdrawn within 3 months and it's still not back. It's 4 years later. We still don't have a regulation book for solar. So everything we're doing is based on this French standard that was released and withdrawn, but it's not a rule, but that's the right way to do it. So when someone's putting solar in, this is what they're supposed to do, and we're just going to briefly run through this because we're most focused on compliance, okay? But let's have a look at the top. It says you get your lead. So let's say I'm a solar company. The lead comes in. The first question they should ask is, do you have an existing certificate, initial certificate that we were talking about? If they don't have one, the company should be saying, do you want one? And if they say no, you stop that job, you run away. You can't issue a supplementary certificate without an initial certificate. And so some solar companies are doing the installation and refusing to issue a certificate because the owner doesn't have an initial one. So they say, I can't issue with an initial one. And I understand the complication. They might have 50,000 rands worth of faults on their house. Now, how can they afford the solar and to fix the installation at the same time? So I understand the problem, but legally, they have to refer to an initial certificate. And we don't care how old that certificate is. That certificate can be 25 years old, as long as it's there and there's a number. Even if it's not compliant anymore, at least there's a number to refer to. Okay. So we would run away from a job like that. But let's say they say yes. So we're going down here. They say yes. We go through the process of inspecting and issuing a certificate. And then we back up at that point where it says is there an existing COC? Well, now there is. Okay. So they go out and they give a quote. So many companies are going and giving these 1, 2, 3 quotes like, oh, you want so much kilowatts? You just go on the website. Oh, that's what it's going to cost. You can't do it like that. That's what's happening with these rental companies. They're going in. We just did one in Melkbos about a month and a half ago. Big double-story 3-phase house with a 3-phase main board, 3-phase subboard. They're going to put a single-phase inverter in. Okay. So now they're putting everything onto this one phase and they're unbalancing the whole installation, which is part of the certificate. Are all the phases balanced? So they're putting everything on one phase. And now the 3-phase distribution subboard, they just link the whole lot together. So now the subboard is now single phase. And the main board is now, most of it's running on single phase. And so they didn't know how to fix it and actually couldn't fix it. So they had to remove the entire system. The whole solar system came out. Buyer was very happy because they didn't really want it, but there was a rental agreement in place. And we can't touch it because it's someone else's equipment. It's a rental. But they charged them 26,000 rand for the removal. They call it a de-installation. And it just happened again now in Fishhook, a property. Also, 20-odd thousand rand de-installation fee for the seller. Okay? And it's so unfair because they created the problem. If it was compliant, then the system could stay and we could issue the certificate. But that's what's happening. So one important thing about solar is an engineer has to sign it off, not just an electrician. So the electrician is signing off all the normal stuff. The engineer is signing off from the panels down to the batteries and the inverter. All the low voltage stuff, the stuff with high amperage that can cause fires. Okay? Low voltage is high amperage. Okay? That arcing story, they've got massive insurance, and so that covers if there's a fault. So you have to get an engineer involved. Then the engineer submits to the City of Cape Town a permission to install request. We did some, I'm even getting the years confused because that's how long it's taken. But like in March 1 year and in August the next year, it got approved. Okay? More than a year to get a permission to install. Nobody's waiting for the City of Cape Town to do that. They're just going and putting it in. The problem is if City of Cape Town see you've got an operating solar system, they will come and make you disconnect it. They'll give you approximately a 6,800 rand fine and make you disconnect the solar. You can keep the inverter, but you can't have the panels connected until that permission is granted, and we'll get more into that now. Then eventually the council approves it, and then you can go and put it in. But in the height of load shedding, who's going to wait a year for permission to install? Everybody's just putting them in. And so there was a massive backlog, and the city's now got an online system which is much better, and it is catching up, but it's still a little bit behind, quite a bit behind. Then after they approve it, you can put it in, but you can't commission it yet until the engineer has signed off. You've got your COC from the installation for the electrical. You submit that to council, and then council give permission to commission, which means to switch on the solar, and then you're done. You get paid. That's what's supposed to happen. In most cases, the application is not even going through to the City of Cape Town. And so in these rental agreements, you read it, and it actually says, we will post-installation register the city. Every one we've done, they haven't even submitted documents. Okay, so what happens now if your buyer buys a house? Now, there's a couple of scenarios here. Let's say the installation was done perfectly. There's nothing wrong with that solar installation. They've got a COC, but they didn't register it with the city. So you've got your COC, you've got our COC, everything goes through. Buyer moves in. City of Cape Town guys working on the pole and says, oh, you guys have a solar system. So they get the inspector out and says, this is not registered with the city. Your buyer's just paid for the solar system, and now he's got to have it disconnected. And he's got to get a COC to say that it's been disconnected, and he cannot reconnect it until that permission is granted, which could take 6 months to a year, depending on how busy they are. Not going to have a happy buyer. But it can only get worse from there. That's if the job was done properly. What if it wasn't done properly? But they've got a certificate, so we're not covering the solar now. We've issued our certificate, or somebody else has issued a certificate for the main property. But the solar certificate is questionable because the installation hasn't been done right. Now they want the City of Cape Town come and switch them off. So they don't go back to the original installer because they can't find him anymore. They get another company like the one we are using, and they find 65,000 rands worth of faults in the solar system. Now they've got 65,000 rand to pay. They've got a fine from City of Cape Town. They have to wait before they can switch it back on for everything to be done and registered. Can you see the potential problem? So I don't have a solution for all these problems, but we need to think about them and advise this. The buyer needs to know that that system's not registered and take responsibility for it, like they would if there was a waiver, if there's a big renovation. At least they know. Many homes, believe, are charging a premium because they're almost off-grid with electricity. So now maybe they're paying an extra 1 or 2% for this house because of the big solar system. But if it's not registered and they can't use it, or it's going to cost them later to fix it, then it's not really a benefit. That the seller should not be charging, or the property price should not be including that, or at least they must sign a waiver or something to acknowledge it. So the people we are working with on these certificates have an engineer, they issue the certificate, and they start the process of registering it with the city. Even if it's not completed by the time the sale goes through, at least it's in the pipeline. And the buyer knows that everything's been paid attention to. Okay. So once everything is registered, this is now online, but this is before it was online. There's an agreement that has to be entered into between the person who's producing the electricity and the City of Cape Town, or Eskom, if it's an Eskom area like Parklands, etc. So it's called a application for the connection of embedded generation. So embedded means within the community that it's coming from. So it's not a solar plant elsewhere that's feeding power in. The solar panels are right generating electricity in the street. Okay. Why is it important for the city to know how much power is being produced in that street? Because they've got cables running up and down the road, and they can only handle a certain amount of power. So if everyone's pumping electricity into those cables, they're going to sustain damage. Okay, so the city has to know. And then what happens even if they don't have solar? So the guy's climbing up on the pole, there's a problem on the pole. He doesn't see any panels. There's nothing on the system about an inverter being on this property. And he goes and switches off and he starts working on the pole. And your system doesn't have the right protection and pushes power back to the pole, and the guy can electrocute himself. So the city has to know, even if there's just an inverter. You don't need an engineer involved, but the city should still be made aware there is an alternate supply on this property for their own safety and for other reasons as well. And then interestingly, when there's a change of ownership, now this is obviously done in our colors and that, but this is straight from a document which you can download on the city's website. It says when transfer of ownership takes place that has SSEG, that's the embedded generation agreement in place, the new owner will be required to sign a new supplemental contract, or alternatively, the system must be decommissioned. So the seller is no longer producing the power, the buyer is now producing the power. So they must enter into an agreement with the city. It's not that they need an engineer. You've got all that in place already, but they just need to sign the agreement. Okay, I don't think this happens very often. My opinion, I'm not sure, but I don't think it happens very often. And then you'll note a little bit further down, where it's bolded and underlined there, it says, an SSEG compliance test report will be required once NRS 0724 whatever is published, okay? That's the French Afrikaans English standard, okay? So when that is there, we'll have a proper test report. We don't at the moment. So if there's solar, try to find out. If it's registered with the city, that means they've got the engineer, they've got the COC. Even if we come and see there are problems, but we're not signing it off, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm only worried about what we have to take responsibility for. But if we see dangerous stuff, we will make the seller aware to get the people back. Because so many properties don't even have, those batteries have got so much power in them. I mean, just 1 5 kilowatt battery, it's dangerous. And if you can't switch it off or there's no fuse in place to protect it, it can start a fire very quickly if there's a problem. So I don't have all the answers, but to make you aware, early on in the sale process, if there's solar, try to find out what exactly is going on. And do they have they registered? And if they haven't, we can put you onto somebody that will properly do it for you. There is a cost for the inspection. It's only $450 to check the whole solar system. And they will do it properly and register and engineer and everything you need. Okay. Any questions on the solar?